Welcome to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. And today is the 7th of December, the day of infamy. Yep, it's Pearl Harbor Day. This is probably one of those holidays I don't have to explain, but I'm going to anyway. Because on the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, planes flying from Japanese aircraft carriers attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, sinking several ships and killing more than 2,000 American sailors. We were not at war with Japan at the time. In fact, the U.S. had not yet entered World War II, which had been raging in Europe for 2 years already, and even longer in East Asia. Until the September 11th attack, this was the deadliest surprise attack in U.S. history. President Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. And it brought the U.S. into the Second World War the next day and may have ultimately decided the war. At least that's the story we tell ourselves, the obvious answer. But I don't usually like to stop at the obvious answer. So what really happened at Pearl Harbor? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's what we're here to talk about. So when I was a kid, we were still talking about the attack as if the Japanese were cartoon villains. I'll spare you the racist language, but those assholes were some sneaky cowards, hitting us with a giant sucker punch before we'd even made up our minds to join the war. They knew they couldn't stand up to us toe-to-toe, so they tried to knock us out before we could hit them back. Oh, and they were also stupid. Why the hell would they attack us in a way that pretty much guaranteed we would enter the war against them? If the bear is asleep, why would you poke it? We still debate that last question. So did the Japanese before the attack. There was a pretty strong sense among the country's national leadership that maybe they should just leave us alone. But some of their best military minds thought a surprise attack was their only shot. After all, by December 1941, we were on track to probably enter the war. The question wasn't if, but when. So why did they think that, and what did they hope to gain? Time for a little background. The Americans and the Japanese had been in a pissing contest in the Pacific pretty much since the beginning of the 20th century, when we occupied the Philippines and Guam after the Spanish-American War. That brought us a little too close for comfort for the Japanese, especially as they modernized their military and started to need steel and coal and later oil, all things they couldn't get from their home islands. Then in 1905, the Japanese kicked the Russians' ever-loving asses in the Russo-Japanese War. That left them in control of the Korean Peninsula, and it was their announcement to the world that they were a serious world power who couldn't be ignored. Well, of course, the rest of the world tried to keep ignoring them. With European colonies and possessions in India, Southeast Asia, and modern-day Indonesia, the nations of Europe figured they had plenty of resources in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Japan was a small country with a strong military tradition and not a lot of resources. Not really worth the effort to try to conquer. Well, Japan knew that too. They weren't worried about anybody trying to conquer them. But after they helped the Allies win the First World War, they kind of figured they had earned a share of the resources Europe was sucking out of the Pacific. And they set up trade agreements to get the things they needed. And for a while, in the 1920s, everybody was mostly happy. Then they went and invaded Manchuria, the part of China that borders Korea, in 1931. And in 1937, they invaded the rest of China. And predictably, the other Pacific powers, that would be the US, the UK, the Netherlands, and France, were a little alarmed. Not because they gave a shit about China, but because Japan was starting to look like a major power that might be able to threaten their dominance in the Pacific. And it was starting to act as if that was exactly what it meant to do. And to be fair, Japan's conduct in Manchuria and the rest of China was enough to alarm anybody. The Imperial Japanese Army was seriously overextended, so its soldiers resorted to brutal tactics to keep the population under control, like massacres, mass rape, chemical attacks, and firebombings. Even if the governments of the US and Europe didn't care about China, the news reports and photographs that leaked out were enough to turn public opinion against Japan. So in 1937, the U.S. proposed an international blockade against Japan. That didn't happen, But President Roosevelt did manage to convince American companies to stop sending war material in 1938. Then in 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam. The U.S. cut off pretty much everything except oil in response. I think we figured cutting off oil might force them to attack us. So we kept the oil flowing, and both countries started thinking hard about what war with each other might mean. We beefed up our troops in the Philippines and moved our Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, in hopes those two moves would help Japan see that attacking us would be a bad idea. Then, Japan took control of French Indochina in July 1941 because the French didn't control their own country anymore and couldn't hold on to their colonies. And the U.S. turned off the oil. After that, it was probably just a matter of time. Japan turned its sights next on the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, to give it a source of oil. That got it another stern warning from Washington, and the escalations kept ramping up. And by late November, both sides knew they were about to have to go to the mattresses. Warnings went out to U.S. bases in the Pacific on the 16th of October and the 24th and 27th of November. But it looks like the threat wasn't clear, so Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short, the commanders at Pearl, didn't prepare for an air raid. Instead, the planes on the land-based airfields were bunched together on the runways to protect them from sabotage, which, of course, made them better targets for attack from the air. I'm not sure they did anything to protect the ships. They did beef up training for the guys watching the radar stations around the island and ordered them to operate from 0400 to 0700 every morning, since dawn was the most likely time for an attack. To be fair to Admiral Kimmel and General Short, Pearl Harbor didn't seem like a likely target. Everybody seems to have thought the Japanese would hit us in the Philippines, since that was so much closer to the oil fields they wanted in the Dutch East Indies. And you gotta figure they thought there'd be a declaration of war first. And to be fair to the Japanese, they tried to declare war before the attack, but the folks at the Japanese embassy in Washington couldn't get the 5,000-word declaration out and get it delivered by the time the attack was supposed to start. History turns on shit like this. So that brings us up to the morning of the attack. Let's see what happened. No shit. There they were. The BS meter for this war story is about a 2 out of 10. Most of the details are as accurate as I could make them, with some simplification for clarity. So if you watch movies or read books about soldiers, they're constantly alert and aware of everything that's going on around them. They're constantly ready for anything, and somehow they always have live ammo when they need it. Throw something at a movie soldier with no warning, and he'll catch it without looking up, just to show you how aware he is. That's true about some soldiers, sometimes. Most of us will just look up after whatever you threw hits us, going, "What the hell?" But in peacetime, especially the kind of peacetime that comes right before a war starts, most of your guys haven't developed that kind of awareness. And they're sure not running around with live ammo unless somebody authorized it. And on Sunday morning, unless you're expecting to be hit any minute, Sunday morning is for sleeping off Saturday night, then finding your way to church because the CO might notice if you're not there. And if you are expecting to be hit, the CO didn't let you go out on Saturday night. Well, 7th of December 1941 was a Sunday, so most of the soldiers and sailors and Marines at Pearl weren't paying attention. Hell, when the first planes took off from the Japanese aircraft carriers at 6:10 a.m., most of them were still asleep. And when the first bombs started falling at 7:55, most of them were still asleep. Because as we've already said, they pretty much knew war was coming. But war is coming and war is coming this morning are two entirely different things. And it's hard for a human to believe the second one unless he's the one bringing it. This is why surprise attacks are effective, right? If you hit somebody when he knows he's in danger, he has to make a mental shift from nobody's trying to kill me right now, but they could be, to some motherfucker's trying to kill me. That's not a very big mental shift, and it happens in about the time it takes for him to switch the safety off on his rifle. Not to mention he's already locked and loaded and whatever equipment he needs is there and ready to go. But if you can hit somebody when he thinks he's safe, he's got to make a much bigger mental shift. from "I'm safe" to "some motherfucker's trying to kill me." Not to mention that before he can respond to your attack, he's got to get his equipment ready. For a rifleman, that might be as simple as loading a magazine in his rifle and locking and loading, then throwing his helmet and body armor on. But for a sailor rolled out of bed by a bomb going off, he's got to wake up, get his uniform on, or at least part of it, get to his anti-aircraft gun, make sure it has ammo or send somebody to get ammo, power it up if it runs on electricity, wait for the rest of his crew to get there if it doesn't, then load the gun, find a target, and start shooting. And that's if he doesn't have to find another route from his bunk to his gun because the ship is damaged or other guys are blocking the way because they're not sure where to go. And that's just at the individual level. When you're talking about a ship, you have to get the whole crew, or most of it, up and to their stations before you can start taking any kind of coordinated action. A battleship like the USS Arizona had a complement of something like 1,500 sailors. I don't know how many had to be working and for how long before the ship could move from a cold start, but it would have been many times longer than the time it took for a bomb or a torpedo to reach the ship. So these poor bastards are in for a rough morning. Let's go through the timeline. 6:10 a.m., the first wave launches. 183 planes launched from 6 Japanese aircraft carriers. These planes were a mix of light bombers, which dropped their bombs from altitude, dive bombers, which dropped lighter bombs from a dive, allowing them to maybe hit their targets better, torpedo bombers, which came in low and released modified torpedoes designed to skim just under the surface of the water and hit the American ships right below the waterline, and fighters, whose job was to destroy aircraft on the ground or kill any that made it into the air before they could get at the bombers. Also at 6:10 a.m., the USS Condor, a minesweeper working outside the harbor, reported seeing a periscope. 6:45 a.m., the USS Ward fired on a Japanese submarine. These were the first shots the U.S. fired in World War II. 6:53 a.m., the Ward radioed headquarters to let them know they had engaged a submarine. The message was in code, and it took several minutes for headquarters to figure out what it said. 7:02 a.m., a radar station on the island spotted the approaching planes. But because radar was a new technology and they didn't really know how to use it, they didn't understand what they were looking at. So at 7:20 a.m., an Army lieutenant dismissed the radar report, believing it was a flight of B-17 bombers coming in from California, because it's much easier for a human to believe what he wants to believe than to dig for news that might be bad. At 7:40 a.m., the first Japanese aircraft reached Oahu, the island that Pearl is on. 7:49 a.m., the commander of the attack wave, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, ordered the attack to proceed. 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell. 8:10 a.m., the USS Arizona, hit in the forward magazine by an armor-piercing bomb, exploded and sank, carrying 1,177 sailors down with it. Almost half of the Americans killed in the attack went down on the Arizona. At 8:17 a.m., the USS Helm sank a Japanese submarine at the entrance to the harbor. At 8:54 a.m., the second wave of the attack began. 171 planes, a similar mix to the first wave, this one commanded by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, launched from the aircraft carriers. Where the first wave had targeted the ships in the harbor, these guys were after the land-based airfields. At 9:30 a.m., the USS Shaw exploded in dry dock. At 10 a.m., the Japanese planes headed back to their carriers. So in about 2 hours of fighting, the Japanese sank 18 American ships or forced them to run aground, including 5 battleships. All but 3 of them would eventually be repaired and returned to service: the Arizona, the Oklahoma, and the Utah. 188 American aircraft were destroyed and 159 damaged, most of them on the ground. 2,404 American service members were killed and 1,178 wounded. The Japanese lost 29 planes and 4 midget submarines, for a total of 55 airmen and 9 submariners killed in the attack. The Americans managed to get a few ships underway, but it doesn't look like any of them actually got out of the harbor. The ships that were out of the harbor on patrol or already underway when the attack started all came back undamaged. They were much smaller targets than the battleships, and it's harder to hit a moving target than one that's stuck on the dock. 8 Army planes managed to get up off the ground, and 6 of them brought down at least one Japanese plane. And some of the anti-aircraft gunners on the ships managed to get to their guns and bring down a few planes, including a black cook named Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller, who manned an unattended anti-aircraft gun and brought down at least one enemy plane officially, and maybe as many as 6. 51 sailors, including Miller, received Navy Crosses, the second highest award the Navy can give, and 15 received Medals of Honor, the highest award for their actions during the attack. And that gives you an idea how much individual courage swung the needle in industrial age warfare, and how big an advantage surprise gives you. There was plenty of courage on the ground, plenty of skill, but they still kicked our ever-loving asses. Now, there are 2 big questions people always ask about the attack on Pearl Harbor. What happened with the third wave of the attack, and where were the American aircraft carriers? Well, the third wave may or may not have ever been part of the plan. The Japanese commander, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, had always planned for the first 2 attack waves. But it may be that the intensity of anti-aircraft fire the Americans managed to put into the air convinced him another wave was a bad idea. Or it may be that his subordinates urged him to add a third wave to the plan and launch it immediately. And he looked at his losses in the first 2 waves and decided not to do that. It's possible that a third wave might have done even more damage, particularly if he had targeted the fuel tanks on the island holding stored fuel for the fleet. It's also possible that with our gunners up and ready for him to come back, we could have done more damage than he would have considered acceptable. Because as the next 4 years would prove, it was only a little bit harder for the U.S. to replace a ship than for Japan to replace a plane. The second question is, where were the American carriers? Now, my American history teacher in high school spun this question into a full-fledged conspiracy theory. The idea was that Roosevelt knew the attack was coming, so he kept the carriers out of the harbor because he knew we would need them. That way he could use the attack to get the country into the war without sacrificing our greatest assets. Now, like all good conspiracy theories, there's just enough here to keep you from dismissing it as bullshit right off the bat. But it's bullshit. Yes, Roosevelt moved the fleet from San Diego to Pearl, and part of his reasoning might have been to offer a juicy target for the Japanese to hit to bring us into the war. But he's not the one who ordered the carriers out of the harbor. The Lexington was delivering Marine Corps planes to the American base at Midway, and the Enterprise was doing the same to beef up the defenses at Wake Island. The third carrier in the Pacific, the Saratoga, was on its way to Pearl from San Diego. If Roosevelt meant to protect the carriers at the expense of the rest of the fleet, he cut it pretty close. Plus, nobody understood until the attack just how important carriers would become, ironically including the Japanese. On December 6th, pretty much everybody still thought battleships were still the big boys of naval warfare. And third, we didn't know just where the Japanese were going to hit us. Most of the military intelligence establishment thought they would hit the Philippines instead. And guess what? They did. That same day, the Japanese hit our bases at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island. So keeping the carriers out of harm's way from a 4-pronged attack would have required a level of accurate intelligence that I just don't see demonstrated at pretty much any time in this war. But the attack tore the hell out of our Pacific Fleet. And until we got the battleships back to the fight in 1944, we had to lean on our carriers and our submarines. And by that time, we had figured out how to fight without battleships. And of course, we haven't talked about the most important thing the attack accomplished. It got us into the war. The next day, the 8th of December, we declared war on Japan. And our conduct in that war, the way we fought and the way we won, changed the shape of the world for the next half a century. Hell, we're still dealing with some of the consequences of that war. So I probably could do a scorecard for this one, but we've gone long enough for a holiday special. Nagumo gets 5s in mass and surprise, and Kimmel and Short get 1s pretty much across the board. Well, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this war story, remember to give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to tell your nerdy friends about me, including that one that you're thinking about right now. Till next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.